This one. I'm not used to standing still for very long, so if I get antsy, I might grab them. First of all, thanks for having me. It's been a while since I've been back up to Portland, and I've just I've been in Oregon for the last week. I need to spend more time in. But so you're probably wondering about the title. So I want to start with a quote that I always heard attributed to Frank Zappa was supposed wrote about something he had done, and his answer was writing about. I always related to that one when people ask me to talk about food when I can't give you things to taste. So that's where the title comes from. Much more on this slide. I just love this picture. So the two mushroom wood associates, but the one on the left is a beefsteak mushroom. Species name probably changed, and the butter bolete on the right. For two really good edibles in my mind, anyway. Changing on the screen here, but not on that screen. So I mean, I can talk about this slide for an hour if you guys want. Yeah. Yeah, there we go. So, yeah. Presentation. I want to talk about, how do we decide what we do with them? And these may seem like a question, but I think it's something we all take for granted. And I think there's a lot more out in the woods than we usually pay attention to. And we'll talk about discussed here, but this is really for me what the point of this presentation is. Eating mushrooms is, can I eat it? And you know, I'd start with your local experts. Uh, this is just a picture of, a pile of them I threw on the floor. That's as artsy as I get, sorry. My wife calls it messy. Anyway, the point is that you should trust your field guides on what's edible. It's edible. If the field guide says it's not edible, it's not edible. When you get really advanced relationships between different mushrooms, you can start challenging some of this stuff. You believe the field guides, and you see the same mushroom in two different guides and it's not edible in one, but it's edible. But the one, what does it mean when a mushroom is edible? If the field guide says it's edible, edible is on the far side of the chart there. We have porcino sitting there. That's a white king bolete. California and in the Southwest and in the Rockies in some places. people, pretty safe things to serve to groups. But at the same time, was deathly allergic to porcini. So they're not edible for everyone. Porcini. Uh, on the other end of this, we have they are occasionally found up here and planted kind of stuff in the city, probably. They're everywhere. Most people are, well, not possibly their life is going to go away pretty quickly. But in the middle, so the second one, right next to the porcino there, are morels, northern hemisphere, all over the northern hemisphere. They're widely eaten. That morels would probably be listed as dubious by most field guides. Morels, even if they're not thoroughly cooked, first of all, are going to make cases involving that recently, including some people who died in Montana a year or two. And at the same time, a lot of people, even if they are thoroughly cooked, there's some significant percentage of people who are actually cannot eat morels. It's also a mushroom very commonly. I know, God, I know more people than I can count on my fingers who ate morels for years and now are in that can't eat it list. So again, what does it mean for a mushroom to be edible? Don't know. Chicken of the woods, same thing. There's a lot of species around the U.S. I think here mostly you probably see conifericola, if I took a guess, the one that grows on conifers. I don't know if you have the hardwood ones. Okay, so you have a couple species here. Um, Depending on where you go, you hear kind of superstitious ideas. If you eat one off this tree, it's more likely to make you sick, whatever. But the fact is, some people just have issues with these. And it's a significant percentage of people. And pretty much everybody has issues with them if they're not thoroughly cooked. So again, there's two vectors, or there's two axes of this edibility thing here. Is one thing is a lot of mushrooms are edible when prepared properly and not edible if they're not. And a lot of mushrooms are just edible for some people and not for others. And there's things all over this spectrum. There's mushrooms that are widely listed as toxic. That I can't think of an example here, but there's some mushrooms that are widely listed as toxic that I know people who eat them with impunity, even though most people who try them get sick. So again, edibility is not always a simple question, and it's really important when you're trying new mushrooms to be cautious about it. Know where they stand on this spectrum too. So if there's a mushroom that you like to eat, that doesn't mean you should serve it to a big group, whether that's your family or the club or your in-laws. I like my in-laws, so I just want to get that on the record. So the next thing that comes when we talk about edibility is you found something you can identify. The other thing is no mushroom is edible. If you can't ID something properly, it's not edible, or it's not safely edible. So confidence is one thing, but knowing, just the idea of knowing when to be confident and when not to be, is a skill in itself that you have to learn as a mushroom hunter. So being able to properly identify is the first thing. If it's not properly identified, it's not safe to eat, period. And it's certainly not safe to serve other people. But so anyway, the picture here, it's amazing how many times I lead walks and people come up to me with mushrooms looking like that. Or my friends, I just got a picture yesterday from a good friend of mine that her husband found a beautiful porcino, except it was moldy. And she's like, "Oh, he's so excited to serve this to my brother, and is it what he thinks it is?" I'm like, "Yeah, it is, but it's also moldy, so you probably don't want to eat it." So, you know, this is really important, and this relates to what happened at the fair. Uh, what I've heard about the poisoning that happened in the fair, to me, in my experience, sounds much more like food poisoning than mushroom poisoning. And you can get food poisoning from mushrooms, even if you identify it right, even if it's a species that is normally edible. If that thing is rotten, if it's got weird bacteria on it, if somebody was in the bathroom and didn't wash their hands and was handling it and then you ate it, you can still get food poisoning from mushrooms. So the condition of the mushroom matters when you're talking about edibility. Um, so then again, when you talk about moving on, you're talking about edibility, you're talking about can I eat it is one question, but should I? If you find, a little tiny little, xylaria or something that's like a little hair coming out of a log, is that something that you should be trying to eat if you find out it's edible? I mean, if you need to collect 100 of something to make a mouthful and you might spend all day doing that, is it worth experimenting? For me, not so much. So, I mean, is it abundant? Is it special? These are questions. Cauliflower mushrooms are very special to me. They're rarely abundant, but they're special enough that even if I find one, I'm excited about it. So yeah, I want to take it home. I want to eat it. Mushrooms like that, I want that. If I think they're special, the prince, that beautiful big Amandia agaricus, they're not they're not abundant most years. So but I know they're special enough that when I find them, I want to get to know them because I want to play with those because they're really cool. So anyway, again, can I eat it? Should I eat it? They're not always straightforward questions. So is it good? This is where this gets really interesting and strange and fun to me. I don't know if you guys have this one here. Don, do you guys have the cocra here? So this is a very common mushroom where I live down. I live in California, south of yeah, in the Bay Area, and this is a really common hardwood associate. It's one of the Caesar's amanitas. We call it the cocra. It is Amanita calyptroderma, beautiful mushroom. In a good year, it's everywhere, and they can be big. I mean, you get caps that are this big and big meaty mushrooms. You can fill your car with them in a good season. And while I'm up here, I know my friends have been telling me it's one of those seasons. Uh, but some people I know say this mushroom is great. They love it. They want to eat it all the time. Other people I know say it's terrible. They don't like it. They don't know why anybody would ever eat it. So is it good? Who do we believe? These guys. I was just talking to somebody about these at the back table. So Lactarius deliciosus group. There's probably 3 different species in the basket in this picture. Most of the field guides in the Western U.S., at least, pretty much most of the field guides in the U.S. list these as kind of mediocre at best. Where my wife is from in Catalonia and northeastern Spain, these are the most prized mushrooms. They run past everything else, including the porcini and the chanterelles, to get to these, and they use them in everything. They cook them in a million ways. You see huge displays of them in the markets. You see them on restaurant menus everywhere. They're really popular mushrooms. And that you hear talk of, oh, it's different species there and they're better. Everybody here say that, doesn't eat them there or here, so I'm not really sure what they're basing that on. I mean, seriously, I don't think I've ever heard anybody who's eaten them in both places say that. And I've eaten them in both places, and I don't say that. Most of the people I know from there, pretty much everybody I know from there, collects them here. So, you know, I think it's just this idea that we're programmed to think this. And there's tons more example of these. These are just kind of the cocra, and these are the first 2 I found nice pictures of. That's why they made it into the presentation. So, how do we actually decide what's good to eat? Um, so, if you don't know the person on the left, that's Noah Siegel. He is probably, I've heard actual academic mycologists call him the best field mycologist in the world. He is an excellent, excellent, excellent taxonomy person, ID person, really knowledgeable, really great. He's co-authored a bunch of really great ID books. He also tells everybody how much he hates eating mushrooms. So why do we care what he thinks is good? Seriously. Um, the guy on the right, that's me. Um, but I like eating mushrooms. I like cooking mushrooms for people. And I know a lot of people who, it's funny to say that, but I know a lot of people at this point who've written field guides. And some of them are like Noah and are great people, great ID people, and are not interested in eating mushrooms. And so, again, why do we care what they think about how good those mushrooms are? And, but the second, and then there's others who love eating mushrooms, but that doesn't mean we agree with their taste. I can think of one person who loves eating mushrooms and I think is a terrible cook. And I'm not going to name any names. I can think of another person, except Noah, because I like to tease Noah. But I can think of another person who loves eating all kinds of mushrooms, written a book, and I just don't agree with his taste. But it's fun to talk to him about this stuff. But the point is, you should absolutely listen to these people about what is safe to eat and what is not. You should trust them. But I really don't care what they think is good. So, how should we decide what's good? Anyone? Exactly. Try it. See what you think of it yourself. Um, I think that a lot of I strongly believe that a lot of what we think is good in terms of food is more cultural than anything else, and that means that what we learn. It doesn't just mean on some national level. It means what your parents like, what if you're going to the club meetings and you're going out with the same group of people and they like a certain group of mushrooms, they're going to teach you that those are good mushrooms, and the ones that they don't like, you're going to learn not to like. So my whole point in all of this is decide for yourself. Of course, learn to do it safely. You need to learn to identify things safely. You need to learn to, if you can't identify something, again, don't eat it. So, again, how should we decide what's good? For me, there's a few basic things. Of flavor, obviously, but there's so much more when you eat than just the taste of something. Taste is a small part of what you're actually doing when you eat. Texture is, to me, just as important as taste. Aroma is really 90% of taste is actually aroma anyway. So all of these things matter. When I say, I'll talk more about what I mean by context in a little while, but the idea of context is, maybe the mushroom reminds you of something and you can figure out, maybe the mushroom makes you think of something and that compels you to use it in a certain way. So, just talking about mushroom flavors, I want to check my email. Hold on. No, I really just want to be able to keep track of the time. Sorry. Uh, Maybe I'll check my emails. So mushroom flavors. There's a million mushroom flavors out there. I mean, shout out some mushroom flavors you guys know. Anise, see, I think of anise more as a smell, but I'm not saying you're wrong. Nutty. There's no right or wrong answer to any of this, really, though. Like there's some mushrooms like those little fairy clubs that have a natural sweetness to them. Some things are really bitter. Some things, just have what we think of as a mushroomy taste, and Some things are more earthy. There's some things have really unpleasant flavors to them that some people describe as putrid. There's sour flavors in mushrooms and piney flavors. There's all kinds of different flavors. And to me, I try not to think so much in terms of quantitatively ranking things as I do just qualitatively understanding them and see if I can fit that qualitative thing into some context that makes sense to me that I want to use. And so again, there's a lot of different mushroom flavors. Aromas, same thing. And now is where I would say the anise kind of thing, and there's all kinds of crazy aromas in mushrooms, like maple. Somebody said with candy caps, and the matsutake smell. See, it's usually my phone that does that when I'm doing this. I can scold somebody else. But there's again something like so on the table here in this picture is candy caps and matsutake, two mushrooms that are prized for their aroma. So again, the candy cap with that maple smell, and the matsutake with that musky, cinnamon, spicy weirdness. And there's some mushrooms have a radishy smell. Some have what they call farinaceous, which is kind of raw flower smell. And there's any smell you can think of, you can probably find it in a mushroom. And again, I don't want to think of it so much in a quantitative way of this is good, this is bad. I just want to say, is this, maybe this is useful to me, maybe it's not. And there are some mushrooms that sadly the aroma is really beautiful when it's fresh, but it goes away when you cook it. And there's some hygrophorous like that, some of those big meaty waxy caps that have this strong sweet anise almondy kind of flavor or aroma, but then you cook them and it goes away and they taste like nothing, and it's really kind of depressing. So I don't pick those anymore. So textures. Again, there's all kinds of textures in mushrooms. There's, and I apologize, I've got this persistent cough that just will not go away. So if I take breaks to cough, you understand. But there's all kinds of textures in mushroom. Cauliflower is a mushroom I think of specifically for the texture. To me, it doesn't have much flavor aroma, but that texture of the kind of like al dente pasta, and it's there's mushrooms that are slimy and mushy, and there's mushrooms that are really firm and dense, like the butter boletes in my first slide are so dense that it's almost like raw potato even after you cook them. They're so crisp and crunchy. There's some mushrooms like the yellowfoots to me are almost like cartilaginous, like a piece of cartilage or tendon or something. And I love that. Oh, thank you. That's service. I wonder what I gotta do to get a sandwich. Hold the mic up and see if you can hear my stomach growl. No, I just ate. I'm not fishing for food. But anyway, there's all kinds of textures, and they all have different places where they might make sense. I'll talk more about this a little later, so I don't want to get too deep. So I've talked about how to evaluate mushrooms, but why is it worth trying new mushrooms? Why is it worth playing this game? And for me, when I go out in the woods most of the time these days, I just wander in the woods, and whatever I see, I see. My ID skills have gotten to a point where I know what I'm looking at, at least in familiar habitats. On the West Coast, I'm usually pretty good. That when I'm walking around, I usually see a bunch of different stuff that I know that I can collect happily. And if I go out and the only thing I want is chanterelles or porcini or matsutake or whatever, if they're not there that day, I go home with an empty basket. And if I learn there's all these other mushrooms that I can use in different ways, then I'm much more likely every time I go out to have a bunch of different mushrooms go home with me that I can use. And so that's my motivation. It just makes every hunt much more likely to be productive. And not just even, there's times I go just wandering around, not intending to pick mushrooms, and I just walk by stuff and go, "Oh, I know that. I like that one." It's fun to have these options. It just makes every time you go out in the woods much more likely to be a fruitful day in the woods instead of just a walk. So, I want to talk a little bit about safety again before I get any deeper. Um, the there's really a couple parts of safety. The first thing, like I said, is if you can't properly identify something, if you can't confidently identify something with 100%, 99% is not good enough. If you're not sure of what something is, even a little bit, it's not safe to eat. That's the first part of safety. And there are groups when you get to know things like agaricus. You don't need to know what species it is. If you can put it in a group with agaricus, they're pretty easy. But in general, you have to know the specific group to be able to play that game. Um, but so the first part is identification. The second part, once you can identify something, is you need to make sure most things are thoroughly cooked. There are a lot of mushrooms that are not, if not thoroughly cooked, will make people sick. Whether you're talking about honey mushrooms, there's honey mushrooms on the table back there I saw. Whether you're talking about morels or chicken of the woods, which was on the table back there, thoroughly cooked matters a lot. It's not safe if you're not going to cook it thoroughly. And I'll talk in a moment about what it means to cook something thoroughly. And when I talk about ID, so in this picture, there's two different mushrooms. I probably could have found a picture where they look a little more alike. The one on the right there is a rubra boleta, so it's kind of Satan's bolete, which is very, very poisonous, will make you very sick for days. You might be in the hospital. Very dangerous mushroom. You don't want to eat it. The two on the left are Swillelis amygdalinus. They call the liver bolete. Where I live, they're very common. They're actually good edibles. They grow often under the same tree at the same time. I found these under the same tree. They're both red port boletes that get, kind of pinkish tints all over them and stained blue. And I've seen people mix them up. Uh, you know, I'm not saying you want to play the game with these when you're not advanced, but when you are advanced, there's things like this that open up. But you need to be very careful that when part of being able to safely identify something means being able to understand what it's not. The things that you could potentially mistake it for, knowing what those things are is really important, and knowing how to know it's not those things. That matters a lot. So the other thing about safety, moderation. One of the things on the table back there is man on horseback, Tricholoma equestri, and I should say group because there's God knows how many species that go by that name. Is kind of yellow-gilled tricholomas. They were really popular edibles in parts of the Mediterranean for generations. Sold in markets all over the place. And a few years ago, I don't know, probably about 10 years ago by now, some group of people in France actually had kidney failure and died after eating them. And it turned out they had been eating pounds and pounds of them for days on end. And so it's one of those, it's still not really clear what happened there. But the point is, in general, there are a lot of mushrooms that if you eat them in reasonable quantities, meaning, eat a meal from them and move on and then eat something else, they're perfectly safe mushrooms. And then if you eat tons of them over the course of a long period of time, they're likely to do you some harm. Now, I'm not saying they're all going to kill you, but I think it's just a good rule in general, not just with mushrooms, but with anything. I don't think you should be eating the same thing in large quantities every day. It's a good thing. Mix up your diet. This is another reason to expand your palate a little bit and learn some new mushrooms, learn some, use different things. Don't eat piles of the same things every day. So again, I've been talking about, why to try mushrooms, how to think about them. So what is it? How do I actually try mushrooms? How do I cook them? The first thing is I usually do not set my pan on fire like this, not on purpose anyway. But I just like this picture, so I stole it from wherever it was I found it. Uh, so usually when I try mushrooms the first time, I'm cook them very, very simply. It's back to the flavor, the texture, the aroma. I want to just evaluate those things and see what the mushroom is. So I cook them very simply. Uh, you guys, many of you, if not most of you, probably know what a dry saute is. So for those who don't, a dry saute, the idea is most wild mushrooms are filled with water. They're lots of water. So you throw them in a pan, all the water comes out. The idea of a dry saute is to get that water out before you start to try and saute them. So you start with a really hot pan, throw the mushrooms in dry, no fat, and just let the water come out. When the water comes out and reduces down and is gone, then you can lower the heat a little bit and add your fat and start sauteing them from there. So, for most wild mushrooms, the first time I taste them, what I do is a variation of a dry saute that I call a wet saute, where I'll start the same way as I just described as a dry saute, but I'll actually add water to the pan when I throw the mushrooms in. So it'll to make sure the mushrooms actually get covered. And that way I know when the mushrooms are cooking down in the water, they're getting cooked through. So I do that actually. That technique's actually good for a lot of mushrooms. It helps the texture of a lot of mushrooms. And we can talk about that a little later if you guys want. But again, when I add the water to the pan, it cooks down in there. I know they're getting cooked through. If they're boiling in there for a few minutes in small pieces, they're going to be cooked through. So that's the first thing. When that water is mostly gone, when when they've been simmering down for a few minutes and there's just a little bit of water left in the pan, it's a trick I learned actually from David Aurora and Wendy So. I'll actually just taste a little bit of the liquid, and a lot of times you get a lot of flavor just out of the liquid. It tells you a lot about what the mushroom really tastes like just from that. Wait until it's cooked down for a while again, just to make sure it's actually cooked. Don't do it right when they start simmering. Do it when the water is almost gone, and it'll be more concentrated that way, so you can taste it better. The other thing is, and this will sound silly to a lot of people, I'll actually taste a piece of the mushroom before I put the fat in. I've learned over the years that there's some mushrooms I actually like better when I don't saute them, just boil them. So there's some mushrooms that I'll just taste like that. Or in general, I'll just usually taste a small piece like that. And I'll usually put a little bit of salt in, but I try not to put too much salt in until the mushrooms have been sauteing for a while. Otherwise, you squeeze so much moisture out of the mushrooms that they shrink down a lot. And when you want big plump pieces of mushroom, that's not really ideal. So anyway, after the water's gone, I'll add a little fat to the pan. I'll lower the heat down to medium low, and I'll start cooking them. I'll usually taste one piece when they first start to brown, and I'll taste another piece when they browned a long way. And the reason is because there are some mushrooms that when they brown a lot, they get bitter. And so I want to try them in kind of different stages. And usually the first time I try mushroom, that's all I do. Just those three kind of things, or four things. Taste the liquid a little bit, taste a piece when it first goes in, right before I add the fat, and then, the early brown and then really brown. And that's it. It's back to the moderation, the safety. Remember that people have weird reactions to mushrooms that other people eat. So the first time you eat a mushroom, be cautious about it. I stopped counting how many different mushrooms I eaten when my list was over 300 different wild mushrooms. And I never had a problem with any of them, including a lot of them the book said were not safe, except for one. And it was one that a lot of people eat, including a lot of my friends, and a lot of people ate the day that it gave me trouble. Uh, if you have problem with a mushroom and you only eat a bite or two, especially the first time, odds are all that's going to happen is you'll feel a little queasy, you'll feel a little weird. No big deal. Don't eat it again. Simple advice. If you eat a lot of it the first time and your body doesn't like it, you're going to have a really, really miserable time. It's also a thing when you're trying new mushrooms, you know, I don't advise always trying a whole lot of new mushrooms at the same time, because if you have problem with one, you're not going to know which one it is. And I will say I'm guilty of doing this. I've been known to try 7 or 8 new ones in a day, but you're taking a little more risk when you do that you don't know what's going on if you do have a problem with one of them. So we talked again about how we evaluate mushrooms, how to try them for the first time. So how did you've tried a mushroom? How do you decide what to actually do with it? And the first thing for me is just back to that list of things we were evaluating. Does the flavor dictate something to you? For me, I'm sorry for the vegans, but morels just scream for butter. And like morels love butter. I don't cook with tons of butter, but with morels, I need butter. And morels also scream for just any of those spring vegetables like favas or artichokes or peas or asparagus, any of those things, just for some reason, just the flavors play so nicely with morels. There's not really a right or wrong answer to any of this. What does a flavor dictate to you? That's really what it comes down to. Does anybody have a flavor of a mushroom that jumps out that you go, I gotta use this for this? Shrimp rousselet. What do you like to do with the shrimp rousselet? Okay, yeah, there you go. The shrimp, yeah, the seafoody flavors. Actually, lobsters work really good with the ceviche for the same reason, because that kind of seafoody edge to it just makes it play nicely in that. I like that. And bonus points for using my own example against me. So, does the aroma dictate something? One of my favorite things. So, on the cutting board there is the prince. How many of you here know what the prince is? Okay, so for those of you who don't know what the prince is, so all of you, whether you know it or not, know what an agaricus is. Agaricus is the supermarket mushroom, the button mushroom, portobello, the cremini. All 3 of those are Agaricus bisporus, the same species. So there are actually hundreds of agaricus that grow wild throughout North America. And a large number of those species, I don't know how many exactly, but I don't know, dozens at the very least, have this natural chemical in them that has a sweet almond extract smell, anise kind of a smell. And that smell stays when you cook it, it stays when you dry it, and it's really fun to play with. I mean, you can just saute those mushrooms up and use them like any other mushrooms, but for me, I love using them in sweet things because I love that kind of aroma in sweet things. So, the picture on the right there, where my mother-in-law is from, on the western side of Spain, they have a traditional cake called Tarta de Santiago, which is an almond cake, and it's a really simple almond cake, just almond flour, eggs, and sugar, and they'll season it. They'll flavor it with like citrus zest and maybe a little liqueur, depending on who's making it. I wonder if that person's ever been there. That's my wife. It's really her recipe, so I can't argue. I'll assume she's right. So anyway, the point is, what I like to do, I just took the traditional recipe and I took this mushroom and I candied the mushroom. I candy the mushroom and I add it to the cake. And I've been serving this cake to people for years and years now. And it's a really fun thing to do. Another mushroom, chanterelles, have this natural fruity kind of aroma to them, and it speaks the same way to me. Where I love using it, I candy it and use it in dessert stuff, and that fruitiness still comes out, and it totally changes the character of the mushroom. But even though you still know the chanterelles there, it's different. So again, the aroma makes me do these things. It doesn't have to be sweet things. It's just I love these sweet examples, and they're what's on my mind now for something. I guess I didn't have dessert tonight. So that might have been fishing. Just saying. So anyway, does the texture dictate something? Uh, the ceviche was. This is a picture of the ceviche. It was mentioned with the flavor thing before, but I wind up using oyster mushrooms in ceviche a lot because the texture of them reminds me a lot of fish. And so for me, that's an obvious thing. Yeah, I had in the other slide about texture, I had a picture of the cauliflower mushroom. And the cauliflower mushroom is so much texturally like egg noodles to me that I primarily use that as a pasta substitute. I don't even really think of it as a mushroom anymore. I think of it as just, fungal pasta. And never really said that out loud, but I guess it doesn't sound that crazy. But there's a million examples of ways you can do this. Again, I mentioned the butter bolets before. Uh, the butter bolets are so crispy and crunchy that I love throwing them into stews because everything else gets cooked down and gets so soft, and then all of a sudden you get these crunchy bites that actually are the butter bolets. I talked about the Lactarius deliciosus group stuff before. The Lactarius, the texture actually changes when a lot of people complain about the texture of Lactarius when they cook them really quickly because they can be really grainy, and it's the same with the Rusula. But if you cook them slowly, especially if you cook them with wet methods, the texture improves. The texture actually tightens up a little bit, gets a little more crisp and firm. So those kind of mushrooms, what the texture tells me is I want to use them in these kind of wet applications. I want to use them in stews. So sometimes the texture just tells me this mushroom is going to be better in this thing. And so sometimes this is a big thing. There's and this on the right side is Swillis sorolescens. On the left is the, I forget which Gomphidius that is, that parasitizes that one. You see these all over the place in the Douglas fir. Uh, Both of these mushrooms actually taste pretty good. How many people in here have actually eaten Gomphidius? Oh wow, I like this crowd. A few of you. My wife raised her hand, but she didn't have a choice. So these mushrooms actually taste pretty good. A lot of people don't like them, especially when they're young buttons. The texture is actually not bad. The texture actually, I think, is pretty good. I would cook either of these up as young buttons with no problem. But as they get mature, they get and like any kind of bolete mushroom, just you cook a big mature porcino, and it's going to be mushy and kind of slimy. At least the cap part of it's going to be. But so if you don't like the texture of a mushroom, but you like the taste of it, there's ways you can use the mushroom and get the taste. So the first thing is with Swillis, they're very, very widely used in Eastern Europe and Northern Europe. Uh, there are tens of millions of people, maybe hundreds of millions of people who regularly eat Swillis and like them. So this idea that we're taught here that they're not good, again, it's cultural. Uh, if you don't like the texture, you can dry them. That's a way they're very commonly used. People dry them and they use them to make stocks and soups and things like that from dried. And when you're just reconstituting dried ones, you're not going to have a textural problem. You're just going to have chunks of dried mushrooms in there. The other thing you can do is you can puree them. If you've got mushrooms where you don't like the texture, if you puree them, like if you're doing a soup that's pureed, the texture doesn't matter because you've got a pureed soup. You're not getting any texture. You could do something like a Duxelles, or a pasta filling or chicken filling or something like that, where again you're pureeing it up. It doesn't make a difference, and you still have a really good tasting mushroom. I've done fancy dinners for lots of people where people pay a lot of money, and I've used Swillis for pasta stuffings for that. In my experience, a lot of these mushrooms, the ones that were taught, the people who aren't mushroom people like a lot of the ones we're taught not to like. It's kind of a fun experiment. I've served some mushrooms the books listed very not good to not mushroom people, and they're happy to eat them. But if I tell mushroom people what they are, they don't want to know. I also serve mushrooms to mushroom people that say they don't like stuff, and then I tell them that's what they just ate. So anyway, I think this picture is unfair. Actually, I think button mushrooms. I mean, they're not super flavorful, but I think they have a good texture, and if you know how to handle them and how to cook them, they're not bad. But there are lots of mushrooms out there that are completely non-offensive, but also completely non-interesting in terms of all of the above: texture, taste, aroma, whatever. And in recent years, I've really gotten into using mushrooms just as bulk. And sometimes it's, for a lot of the people in this room, if we're mushroom hunters, we're eating a lot of mushrooms. It doesn't have to be all about the mushroom flavor. It doesn't have to be all about the mushroom texture. Sometimes the mushroom is just filler, and I'm fine with that. And it's nutritious filler. It's, there's protein, there's fiber, there's nutrients of various kinds. So I've been doing this a lot, and I will take mushrooms that nobody likes to eat, like Rusula brevites or like white button mushrooms, and I will just boil them, and I'll use the bulk to make hummus instead of using chickpeas. So there's a lot of things we can do with mushrooms. That's all I'm going to say. We don't have to get into every possible example, but just, even in a dish, you make a stew, you make a saute, and you just need extra bulk in there. You use the boring mushrooms. So you have a few of the really good flavored mushrooms, and you have a whole lot of these kind of bland, non-interesting ones. Use them for that. Use them to just bulk it up. A lot of times, the non-interesting ones are actually pretty good at soaking up other flavors. So I mentioned context before. And it's funny, I was just talking to Don and Pam about this one today. So sometimes mushrooms just make you think of things. I've got this crazy example here, but we're always taught about how shaggy manes are, you got to use them quick before they start to deliquesce and get all inky on you. I had a conversation once upon a time with David Aurora, and he told me, I don't get that. It's actually no reason not to eat them when they start to deliquesce. There's nothing wrong with them. There's not, bacterial, there's no secondary thing. It's just a natural part of the life cycle of the thing. And so I started playing with it, and it just obviously made me think of the typical kind of squidding thing that's popular in a lot of the world. And I mean, obviously, it's not going to taste like seafood. It's going to taste like this intense mushroom flavor. But you can make some really cool food. The black pasta with a black sauce is kind of extreme, but I've served lots of people doing kind of cooking demos over the years. I've served lots of people just a black risotto where I'll make a puree out of the inked out shaggy manes and just serve the black risotto, and it flavors it really good. It makes it beautiful. And I've converted a lot of suspicious, skeptical people doing that. But there's other things like puffballs, which to me are very bland. Most puffballs don't interest me much, but then one day I had an epiphany. Oh, they kind of remind me of tofu. and I just started boiling them and putting them into recipes like I would use tofu. And then suddenly puffballs became interesting after that. They were really fun to use after I did that. Because I actually liked to, I'd never sit around and just eat a block of tofu any more than I would sit around and eat a puffball. But when I have a dish to cook it in, all of a sudden, oh, these are really cool. And we talked about the cauliflower mushroom as pasta. There's a lot of these kinds of things. The limit here is your imagination on what something might suggest to you. So when I've talked about experimenting with stuff, when is it worth actually experimenting with a mushroom, making it try to work? And the first thing is it common? Is it reason? Is it common and safe? The swillis. There's a couple different swillis species on the board on the right there. There are occasional stories about people having bad reactions to swillis, but they're pretty safe mushrooms. They're everywhere. They're easy to identify. So to me, that's a good place to experiment, especially when you consider that, again, there's probably hundreds of millions of people who eat them regularly. So that should tell you that somebody thinks they're good and worth eating. So to me, that made me want to experiment with Swillis. This picture in the middle where I live, again, is very common mushroom. I'm pretty sure it's up here, but probably not nearly as common. Is Entoloma medianox, a midnight Entoloma. I know I've seen it in Washington, so I'm sure it's here as well. Not common, but where I live, I see it all the time in like kind of the redwood areas that have just scattered other trees in it. And it's one of these things that I could collect baskets of it sometimes. And I know so many people who love to eat it. And so I keep trying to cook it up and I keep trying to figure out why those people love to eat it so much. But I haven't given up yet. Every year or two, I break down and I try again. But I'm kind of at the point where I'm waiting for one of them to cook it for me and explain what it is they think is so great. But I have an open mind. That's the point. Uh, so the one on the left, I heard a little discussion of this when before I started. I heard some people talking at the table about Amanita muscaria. Uh, this is a mushroom that, for me, it's worth it for a couple reasons. I'm not telling everybody else they should eat it. You can make up your mind for yourself on what you think is safe and what you think is worthwhile. But this mushroom is interesting to me because I often find large amounts of it when I don't find anything else. And it can be a big, meaty mushroom. And there's days I go out where it's literally the only mushroom I see, and I can fill my basket with it, and I can't find anything else except maybe a few little mycenas. And so that's what made me interested in it. And I don't want to get too deep into this, but I also think that part of the reason I started in the first place willing to play with the detox, and the detox is as simple as boiling it a couple times. It's not a deep chemical process. But part of the reason I was willing to play with that process is because when I looked into it and researched it, it sure seemed like the dangers of this mushroom were overblown. It absolutely will make you sick and has some pretty nasty psychoactive effects that I have no interest in if you don't treat it. But I mean, in all of history, you can't really find any intoxication deaths of it except maybe one suspicious one. When you hear stories of people dying from this mushroom, it's like hearing stories of people dying from drinking alcohol where they drowned in an inch of water. People do stupid things while on it, but again, I'm not going to be in situations where that's a risk I'm worried about. So anyway, that's why this mushroom was worth it for me to play with, because it's plentiful when other things aren't, and I don't think it's as dangerous as it's made out to be if you're not completely silly about what you do with it. So I don't want to get too deep into that. Um, So I want to kind of wind down a little bit, but the point is that the point of all of this is mushrooms. There's not so much about good or bad mushrooms. Decide for yourself. Um, there's not a lot of right or wrong choices with mushrooms. Be safe, obviously. The wrong choice is not being able to safely ID anything. The wrong choice is eating way too much of something. The wrong choice is serving things to other people that are not generally safe for wide audiences. But when you're cooking with mushrooms, it's really much more about what are you doing with it? How are you using it? That's every choice you make affects what's good. I don't want to use chanterelles the same way I use matsutake. I don't use lettuce the same way I use string beans either. Mushrooms are different. Think of them differently. Think of how you can use them differently. And having said that, usually people get so hung up about I have this mushroom, what is the right way to use this mushroom? Once you get to know the mushroom, you get to know how to coax its good things out of it a little bit. Don't worry so much about substituting things in different recipes. It'll change the recipe, but that doesn't mean it's going to make it bad. It's just going to make it different. So don't get too hung up on that. I just thought this picture was funny. Somebody sent this to me a few weeks ago. I kind of want to look at it for a minute too. I haven't seen it now in a week or two. But again, a big part of what I really want to get across with this presentation is just make up your minds for yourself on what's good. Make up your minds for yourself on what you like. Explore, experiment. Don't worry about what other people say is good or bad. Life is too short for that crap. You know, that's really all. More than anything, that's what I want to get across with this presentation. Be safe about it. Be safe about experimenting, but experiment and decide for yourself. And then I want to talk for a few minutes, and then I'll let you go, or I'll stand up here and answer questions. But so first of all, the website up on the top, the Mushroom Hunter's Kitchen, is just my book website, which probably hasn't been updated in months, and it's just a stub for the book. There's not a lot of excitement there. The other website there, my next big passion project is about kind of regional Spanish food. And if you're interested in that, that's a website I started as kind of trying to figure out my next book projects. I haven't updated it in a while, but in the next few months, I'm going to get back to that and start working really hard on that. So about the book, though, so some of you here, I see a couple copies of the old book sitting in front of me here, and so I this new book is a heavily revised version of the old book. And let me talk about what the book in general is, and then I'll tell you what the difference is. So when I started working on the book originally, I was really frustrated. I work as a chef, and I'm an obsessed mushroom hunter, so I always had way too many mushrooms in my fridge. And even as a professional chef, I always wound up making the same like three or four things with them all the time. And when I went through my hundreds of cookbooks, which I really do have hundreds of cookbooks, or I went online looking for stuff, it seemed like everything I found, or almost everything I found, was kind of Betty Crocker, like the kind of stuff my grandmother would have made for my mom in the 1950s when my mom was a little girl. And like, there's nothing wrong with that. There's a place for that. I like some of that stuff, but it's not what I eat every day these days. And I wanted food that was more like the kind of food I was cooking and eating at work and at home every day. So a big part of the book was just trying to find new ways to use mushrooms and explore new types of recipes. And the second thing, which I kind of ties into that, is so much of what we're taught about how to handle mushrooms, how to cook mushrooms, is based more on old lore and mythology than it is on the actual chemistry and biology of the mushroom. We treat mushrooms like they're vegetables, and they're not. And silly things like don't get mushrooms wet. I wash all of my mushrooms in water, and I don't feel bad about it. And it's nobody's ever complained about the way I cook mushrooms to me. So people still pay me to cook them. So I don't feel bad about washing my mushrooms in water. I cook mushrooms in water all the time. I boil a lot of mushrooms, things like that. That I want to challenge the way we're taught to think about mushrooms. I want to make you reevaluate and not be afraid to do different things with mushrooms. And then the final thing is pretty much what this presentation's been about, and that is there's so many things in the forest. I want people to explore all the other mushrooms out there. And it doesn't mean you need to eat all those mushrooms to use the recipes, but I really wanted to open people's eyes to what's out there and show them that they could use them in simple ways at home. Um, so that was the point of the book the first time. And with the new edition, a publisher came to me and wanted to do this. I told them if I was going to do it, I was going to do it my way, and I wanted it to be different enough to be worth people's time. So, in the 7 years or 8 years between the two of these books, I learned a lot, obviously, and I wanted to change some things that I obviously have learned, add some things that I've learned. I swapped out about 25 recipes. A lot of the recipes that stayed have been revised in pretty significant ways. A lot of the writing is redone, a lot of it's reorganized. There's some new stories in there. There's a lot of new photography. I think it's just a prettier book. So anyway, I'm not a salesman, I'm a chef. So I'm not, I have books. I'm happy to sell books if anybody would like a book. I'd be happy to sell you one. But that's the difference in the book. My thing with the publisher was when they asked me to do this, I told them if they want to do this, I want the book to be interesting enough that if anybody bought it again, they didn't feel cheated. Basically, I wanted it to be a different enough and interesting enough book. So anyway, that's as much as I really want to say. Happy to stand here and answer questions. I'm happy to do a little song and dance if that's preferable. Yes. Yeah, so this is something I always do when I do cooking presentations, and you would have had it tonight if nobody got poisoned a couple weeks ago. But so the question was, with the ceviche, do I boil the mushrooms first or use them raw? Even if the mushrooms are something that people eat raw, like the cocra or Caesar's amanitas, I always boil them first. And this is back to mushrooms are not. So I said mushrooms are not vegetables. I always tell people also mushrooms are not fish. That surprises some people, I think. I like to think so anyway. But so fish get their structure from proteins. When the way ceviche works, the acid and the lime juice kind of denatures the proteins the way cooking does. Uh, Mushrooms get their structure from chitin, which does not break down that way. You can pour acid on a crustacean shell and come back in a few years, and it's still going to look like a crab shell. Um, so the idea with mushrooms, yeah, I boil them first when I'm making ceviche. And how long enough to cook them through, long enough, basically burst the cell walls. With mushrooms, again, they're not vegetables. Vegetables, you boil them, their structure comes from cellulose, which is a water soluble starch. You boil vegetables, you walk away from the pot, you come back in an hour, you have some cloudy water with fibers floating in it. With mushrooms, once the cell walls burst, once they're cooked through, the texture doesn't change. So I boil them for, I don't know, 3 to 5 minutes. If I'm not sure they're cooked through, I give them an extra few minutes. I don't worry about overcooking them because the texture doesn't change once they're cooked through. Even if you cook them for an hour, the texture is not going to change. So that's a really important thing to remember about mushrooms. Yeah.
We have thousands of therapies. What is the go-to source without a microscope?
So
To figure out whether they're
So for me, the question was how to figure out agaricus, like how to figure out what agaricus is what. I learned agaricus using David Aurora's Mushrooms Demystified. And there's a section in the front of the agaricus chapter in that book where he talks about the different groups and how to put them into the different groups. And that's where I really learned. With agaricus, once you can get them into those sections, they're really like it doesn't matter. If you're interested in geeking out about it, you can get to species sometimes, but once you know they're in a certain group, you're good to go. And really, the biggest thing is learning to identify the phenol group because all of the other ones are edible for most people. And so the phenol group is the one with the kind of the xanthodermis, which is a really common lawn mushroom. But there's also a couple common lawn mushrooms that are also edible. But so the easiest way to learn the xanthodermis is the smell. All of the mushrooms in that group have a certain smell. I've heard that smell described a million different ways. I don't know if any of them are meaningful until you hold one in your hand and get that smell. There's some of them in the back there. Afterwards, if you want, I'll show you the smell. You get to know that smell. Practice just scratching them and getting to know that smell. When you get confident with that, agaricus are really easy. Either it's that or it's edible. I mean, if you want to learn the species, that's years of practice. But putting them to groups, you can learn. If the hardest thing is just learning that smell, and sadly, some people just can't get that smell. Some people just don't have the receptors or something. I'm not sure what the right way is to explain it, but some people don't smell that substance. But if it's a small percentage, it's like 5% or something.
phenol.
Yeah, the phenol smell. But if you can smell that, if you can train yourself on that smell, once you're confident and you really know that smell, they're very easy to know if it's in that group or not. But again, it's back to being confident and knowing what confident means versus being accurate. But I can show you after this. We can grab those and I'll show you kind of the trick and the smell afterwards. If you can wait around, we can do that. Yeah. Oh, so how long to cook mushrooms? I'm so remember what I was saying. I don't believe in these rules of this mushroom needs this much cooking time. There's so many variables that go into that. How many are in the pan? How much moisture is in the mushroom? How hot is the pan? Is there a lid on it? Is there not? Is how much fat? There's so many variables. I can get something cooked through in 3 minutes that you might have in a pan for 20 minutes and not get it cooked through. What I was talking about before, remember what I talked about, what I call the wet saute? If you do that and you get a mushroom, like the mushroom is covered with water and you boil that down, that mushroom's going to be thoroughly cooked. If another thing you can do if you want to be sure something is thoroughly cooked, you can get a pot of boiling water. You can boil the mushroom for 5 to 7 minutes, the pieces of the mushroom for whatever, say 7 minutes. And then after that, drain it and saute it. After that boil, it's going to be thoroughly cooked. If it's in pieces, if you leave it, whole or something, it might not be. But yeah, if you're worried about thorough cooking, that's what I would think about. I wouldn't worry too much about specific times because they're kind of they don't mean a lot really without a lot more context. Yeah.
I have the opposite problem. Last weekend, I was out in Old Country. My goal was to go eat something very successful. Why not? I boiled them for 5 minutes, sugar water, kind of soft. I put them in the dehydrator, and they squish down into this blackened mass.
So what I would do if you want to candy things, um, what I usually do when I candy things is I'll simmer in syrup until the syrup gets thick. And that syrup could be juice, it could be simple syrup, it could just be sugar and the mushrooms that just cook down. But I would cook them until they get thick and until the syrup gets thick. And you'll have a lot more of the sugar in the mushroom there, which will help give it some structure if you want to dehydrate it. And then I would, as you dehydrate it, I would keep checking on it until it gets to the texture you want. If you just kind of boil those things, yeah, you can. I imagine it would be like just dehydrating kind of a witch's butter or something, where good luck finding it when you're done. But yeah, I would check the dehydrator every little while until you get it where you want it to go. But I would also cook it a lot more than 5 minutes in the syrup. I would let whatever you're cooking it in actually get syrupy and thick first. That'll help give you structure and it'll also give you a lot more flavor. Yeah. So Boletopsis. So I've heard it called the power mushroom. There was one on the table back there I saw. It's a really cool looking mushroom. It's really dense. I have played with it a couple times. I found them to be really bitter when I've used them, and I've tried boiling them and getting some of that bitterness to go away. I've tried pickling them a little. Um, I haven't found them to be very pleasant. I really like the texture. The flavor to me like is a little much. Like the bitterness. I had trouble getting past the bitterness when I've gotten them. Yeah, I've had trouble getting past the bitterness. I've talked to people who really like to pickle them, and for them that's good enough. They're a very rare mushroom for me to see, so I don't get to play with them often. I was in the dunes this week, a little south of here, and I saw more of them in the dunes in one day, like 10 times more in one day in the dunes than I've seen in my whole life. So yeah, I haven't played with them enough to give you a better answer than that. Yeah, I've heard the same thing. I've heard they're super prized in Japan and maybe like Korea or something, but I haven't really heard any clear answer on what they're doing with them. So yeah, I wish I had a better answer. You're saying they actually grow them? Oh, they grill them. I think they grow. Yeah. No, I haven't tried grilling them, so I have no idea. Yeah, it's something I need to look into. I don't know. Yeah, most underrated mushroom. My wife's gonna be mad at me for saying this, but the Lactarius deliciosus. They're really good if you know how to use them. Maybe really the most underrated mushroom is probably shrimp rusula. I think shrimp rusula are about as good as anything in the forest, and I don't think very many people pick them. I think most people don't know how to properly identify them, and they grab any rusula that looks roughly like them, and they think they're shrimp. But once you know what shrimp really are, they're really, really good, and they go in pretty much almost any application you can imagine. They're good. They're probably the most underrated thing, I think, for most people. I see a few heads like, yeah. They're really good. Anything else? Oh, the shrimp rissola? So the Lactarius and rissola in general, like I said before, really like wet cooking. It really helps their texture. So I'm back to that kind of wet saute thing I talked about. And I'm sorry. Oh, I thought I heard something. No, I thought I heard it behind you. um, but yeah, so just again, hot pan. When the pan's really hot, throw them in the dry pan and add water to the pan to cover them. And by the time it cooks down, it improves the texture. And then lower the heat, add the fat, and they're really good in stews and things like that too. I love them in stews. Um, Really weird little side note tangent thing. The shrimp here, when you cook them, they get really dingy color. I was in the Rockies a couple years ago. There was a big shrimp rissola flush in the Rockies, and they all turned red when you cooked them. It was so weird. In Germany too. Yeah, it freaked me out at first. Somebody handed me some like these are not shrimp, and then I cooked them like, oh, they really are shrimp, and they turn red. I'm still tripping on that, and it's been a couple of years. I'm glad to know it's not just the Rockies. Yeah, I like cooking with avocado oil because it goes high temperature. It doesn't have a lot of flavor. Um, I stay out of the debates on kind of nutrition stuff and health stuff, and some people want to argue about which oils are healthier. I have no opinion that I'm going to state publicly on that. I do have opinions privately if you get some liquor into me. But no, yeah, that was a little bit fishing. Yeah, yeah, we'll start taking bids on what alcohol people have for me. But no, I cook a lot with what I call neutral oils, and neutral oil to me is just oils that don't have a lot of flavor but can handle higher heat. And avocado oil is one of those. Avocado oil, grapeseed oil, canola oil. I know canola oil a lot of people don't like, and I'm not going to get into that here and now. But yeah, I like grapeseed oil.
Brad, we have a question from the live stream. Someone's asking about gills and pores and any species for removing them. The effort or a good idea.
So, yeah, that's an interesting question.
Can you repeat the question?
So the question is about, is it worth removing gills or pores sometimes from mushrooms to cook them? I think that a lot of times when people do it, it's just cosmetic. They don't, like with the big hedgehogs, they don't want all the spines and all the teeth in the dish. They look funny. Restaurants will remove the pores from cremini or from portobello because they don't want the brown getting into the dish. Most of the time with stuff like that, it's more cosmetic than anything. With mature boletes, there are, and I don't just mean porcini, I mean like bolete in the general sense of pork mushrooms. When they're mature, there's good reason to do it sometimes, but with the caveat that the pores are usually the most flavorful part of mature pored mushrooms. So if you're removing the pores, don't discard them unless they're really buggy and gross. There's a few different things you can do with them. One, you can just set them aside and dehydrate them. They're really intense, awesome flavored things dehydrated. Two, you can just throw them in a pot and make stock from them. They make really flavorful stock. Or three, you can just saute the mushrooms, and then when the mushrooms are almost done, then add the pores back in. If you leave the mature pores on when you cook down boletes, they tend to kind of just disintegrate off and turn into this slimy coating in the pan, which just burns. So if you want to eat them fresh, you can just kind of toss them back in when the mushrooms are mostly cooked and just kind of get them cooked through at the very end. There is a thing that Wendy So was showing people years ago, and probably still is showing people, where she just takes the mature pores off of porcini and just kind of steams them and serves them just really simply like that. And it's really interesting, kind of cool way to serve them. We did that with Oriobulitas mirabilis at Thanksgiving last year, the admirable bully, and they were really good. They were really lemony and nice. So yeah, I definitely wouldn't discard them. At home, I pretty much never scrape gills off of mushrooms unless there's something wrong with them. In a fine dining setting, occasionally I'll do it if it affects the way a dish looks at the end. But other than that, it's usually not worth the energy. Uh, you had your hand up a few times. Sorry.
I'm just curious how
So in Catalonia, they use them in a million ways. So the question is, how do they use the lactarius in Spain? I have seen them on menus in about 50 different ways. One of the most common things is just to grill them. They'll just grill them over low heat, salt, pepper, olive oil, or just salt, olive oil, maybe garlic and parsley. I always joke that my wife's answer to every question is olive oil, garlic, and parsley, and she generally doesn't wait for the question. Um, but they'll use them. I've had them served with various kinds of stewed things, braised things. I've seen them as stuffing in squid. I've seen them, they use them in any possible savory dish you can imagine. I've seen them thrown into in some form or another. They just really like them. They use them in a lot of different ways.
All right, well, it's about time to wrap up. We're going to ask Chad to hang around and answer questions one-on-one. Lots of mushrooms in back there. We're good for about 15 more minutes before we have to clear out.
Yeah, so if anybody wants, I have books up here. I can do cash or Venmo for 30 and credit card for 32.